Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Bite podcast. And today I'm joined by James Valiant, Miguel Connor, and Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about the multi-authored mess that is Paul's letters. And we're also going to be talking about the Gnostic Paul. So basically, canonical Paul versus the Marcionite / Gnostic Paul. So we're going to be getting into a lot of stuff Paul related tonight. And the first thing I want to start us off with is when one looks at the letters and sees all the glaring internal contradictions, there's different ways one can take it. Well, Paul's writing to different audiences. Could that be why there's contradictions and changes in style? Or is it because Paul didn't write a lot of it, or maybe he wrote none of it? But something that I don't really see people noticing, even though the epistles outright say so, is, and this is something I'm going to be pointing out in my forthcoming article for your journal, Bob, on this issue, is 8 out of the 13 epistles attributed to Paul. I say 13 because Hebrews doesn't claim to be by Paul, so I don't know why we call that the 14th letter. Why bother? 8 out of the 13 letters attributed to Paul claim to be written by more than one person. Just read the beginning of 1st, 2nd Corinthians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, Philippians, Philemon, Colossians. That's a lot of them right there. Romans, well, the difference with Romans is the co-author puts himself in Romans 16 or in the beginning. But all these letters are claiming to be written by multiple authors. So, Bob, I want to start with you. When you see that, and we had conversations on the phone about this recently, because I used this as a different explanation to say, well, could the contradictions and changes in style of the epistles be explained by literally what they claim to be written by multiple authors?
Yeah, this gives a name, so to speak, to the theory of von Manen, which I have embraced, that you have so many contradictions in, for instance, especially in 1 Corinthians, where it seems like every chapter pointedly rebuts the one before it on issue after issue, that you have to wonder, was this written by, if it was written by a single author, it's got to be either Paul as a multiple personality, or Legion, the Gerasene demoniac, who says, my name is Legion, for we are many, and different demons dictated. Of course, that's ridiculous, but what you've suggested sort of really puts a halo on von Manen's view. Yeah, this would explain it. You don't necessarily, well, I guess I had assumed that there must have been an original Pauline epistle, whoever wrote that, but other Paulinists later liked that and revered that text, but couldn't resist putting in rejoinders here and there, because otherwise, what do you make of it? My teacher, Darrell Dowdy, years ago said that scholars have finally come to admit that in the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, you can't trace a continuous thread of logic through most of it. You have to, it keeps changing the subject, and form criticism, for instance, said, well, yeah, the way to explain that is it's like a patchwork quilt of bits and pieces they had that they're working into one big tapestry. Yeah. And Dowdy said, why don't we recognize the same thing about the epistles? How many commentaries on these letters are taken up almost completely with trying to harmonize all the variant tiles in the mosaic. Like as Gordon Fee, another professor of mine, once said, who believed 1 Corinthians and most of them were all unitary Pauline works, he said that he would say that you've got to ask yourself not so much what a certain verse or group of verses mean, but you do that too, but what's the point? Why is this here between A and C? Why is B there? What does it have to do with those things? And so he would come up with a kind of a rationale as to how the one really addresses the other, though it's not obvious. Well, you can only do so much with that. It just seems absurd after a while. And so, shouldn't you come to the same realization concerning the epistles as you did with the Gospels, that these are patchwork quilts? But you still have to ask, what sort of Sitzenleben does that imply? How would you explain such an odd literary product? And the way I vaguely pictured it was, later Paulinists kept throwing their 2 cents in. And that's very close to what you're saying. But what the big advance in your theory is that, hey, there are named collaborators. Wouldn't that kind of solve it? Different ones, Paul, Timothy, Sosthenes, and so on, wrote different, not quite agreeing parts of the letter, and they sent it off that way. There's still some problems there, but that really comes very close to a solution to the whole thing. Why so many voices? Because it says there are many different writers.
Right. And that explains why there's a different eschatology in First Thessalonians and the eschatology in Second Thessalonians.
Mm-hmm.
Co-authors were responsible for more about one over the other. And when you look at the letters that are not co-authored, the ones that are not co-authored is Galatians, Ephesians, 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Those 5 letters are the only ones that do not claim to be co-authored. The rest are. And when you look at those 5 letters by themselves, they actually look a bit more consistent with each other. But the thing is that when you look at, let's just take, for instance, Paul's view on women. Well, in 1 Timothy, he wants women to be quiet and not teach and lead in churches. But elsewhere, Paul says the opposite. Well, where he says the opposite are in the epistles that are co-authored. Romans, for instance, was co-authored. And so I think what's happening is that the co-authors are the ones with a different view on women than Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what that issue is. Also, I notice audiences, that's also an issue. And as you pointed out earlier, Bob, yes, it's not, it doesn't explain everything, but it comes close. And I think the final element that explains it is if one puts the letters after AD 70. I think the combination of co-authorship with the epistles being after AD 70 works together very well. And I want to bring Marcion into this situation. And I also want to get the thoughts of Jim and Miguel as well, if they have any right now, on this. And after I bring up this point, is that it would make more sense if Marcion was the one cutting out, remove the co-authors, remove the contradictions from canonical Paul, remove the mess. Because if canonical Paul is post-Marcion, that doesn't make sense in light of this theory, my theory of co-authored anthology. But part of me is like, why do I bother calling it my theory? The epistles are telling you pointedly. But yet, the strange thing is that people aren't looking at it that way. They keep saying Paul's letter to the Corinthians, like it's Paul and Sosthenes' letter to the Corinthians. It's Paul and Timothy to the Corinthians. It's not just Paul. Read the beginning of the letter. As they're not merely scribes; they're being put on the same level as Paul. But in Marcion, the co-authors are not mentioned. Well, Timothy's in Marcion's Paul, but he's not a co-author. He doesn't have that role. That's gone. And Marcion, of course, wanted Paul to be the only authority. He wanted to get rid of the other ones. So canonical Paul is an expansion on Marcion's Paul, which is just getting the whole thing backwards, in my opinion. Then I'm almost done. Then you'd have to imagine Paul's authority being divided by Catholic interpolators. They wouldn't want to divide his authority.
That's the
They'd
thing.
want to do the opposite.
I think the point you make there that's really powerful is that Marcion would be purifying the authority to Paul. Why would you dilute the authority of Paul with these, lesser named, or Timothy, I guess, Sosthenes, they're interesting guys, but do they have the authority of Paul? And why would you dilute the authority of Paul? If you were trying to say, hey, this was written by Paul at all, you'd say it was written by Paul. Now, I guess one could say that, look, the difference between First and Thessalonians is a matter of time, or the difference between Romans and Corinthians versus the first letter to Timothy on women, it's a question of who your audience is. And someone could say that. But one thing that, and we happen to have with Bob here, one of the great authorities on the mess that is Paul's letters, there's only so much of that you can do, where you can say, okay, over time, he changed his view on eschaton, or to this audience, he'll say this about women, and in another one say, okay, no, women can be teachers. Oh, no, women got to shut up in church. But there's still, I think, conceptually the issue of if they are writing together simultaneously, normally co-authors, they can have all kinds of disagreements, but it won't go into their co-authored work. That is to say, everything that's in the co-authored work, unless they piece it out for us. Oh no, that's that guy. No, I co-authored a book, and so if we agree about every sentence in the book, and if there were such a difference, we would say, oh, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. So the difference is when it comes down to, say, the difference in voices or language, that is really well explained by co-authors and could even be explained by simultaneous co-authors. But if we have real doctrinal difference, and let me frame it as strongly as I can, be the devil's advocate here, if it is worth saying and teaching, then why would you have something flatly contradictory? Let me put it that way. The differences are so striking that, of course, the one thing they'll disagree about what is pseudo epigraph and what isn't pseudo. But the one thing they'll agree on is, well, look, we got different themes, we got different voices, we got different. The idea, the consensus idea is, look, there's clearly true, but then when you look, like Bob just pointed out, just look within First Corinthians. It seems like their attitude about certain things are changing almost from chapter to chapter, so that you have to say to yourself, is there some split personality, some schizophrenia, like Bob just pointed out? But pushing back, I guess, in the most reasonable way I can, wouldn't they agree? In other words, if it's worth putting down in that attitude, at least, why would you have a contradictory attitude in the same letter at the same time by co-authors? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would be a problem. But then again, I remember reading a book by David Wells in the early 70s called, I think it was Revolution in Rome or something, but it was about Vatican II. And he said, if you read the documents of Vatican II, you realize that there are different incompatible views, like papal authority versus collegiality. And wait a minute, which are we to follow? Well, they couldn't really leave it that way because their driving concern was that you have a compromised document here, that if it didn't say enough about this, some bishops were not going to vote it in. And so you had a kind of a, one from column A, one from column B situation. It's conceivable you had something like that going on if you did have like a studio of several Paulinists who didn't completely agree, like the way in Galatians you have Paul and Barnabas having a cat fight. They obviously had different. I mean, it's a cheap shot for them to say Barnabas is a hypocrite like Peter. In other words, you just think their view is inconsistent. They're not just cowards. I mean, it just sounds that way to me. It's just cheap polemics, and you could have something like that in a composite epistle. That take your choice. There's something here for everybody because there's something here from everybody.
I'd also like to add, and this is something else. This is something else I'm going to note in the paper. I'm going to note some examples for co-authorship, but the paper's primary goal is to provide internal and external evidence that canonical Paul was written in the 90s AD, which is this is something that I believed years ago that I believe again. And when I do think a little bit of it, but not much of it, there's a small bit of it predates 70. And what does predate 70, I think, is what Clement's talking about. But when you look at Clement's letter, he doesn't know canonical Paul. He knows a letter to the Corinthians. Someone in the chat mentioned, I'm going to pull it up actually. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Here we are. Extra music. Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a wonderful one. What is the evidence of the church at Corinth or Galatia at all in 50 CE? Well, I can tell you the answer to Galatia right away. None. As for Corinth, you got a very small one that Clement's talking about, and I think it's more like 30s AD. So I would say really early, but it sounds like to me the original movement was more centered around Corinth based on what Clement's saying in his letter. Corinth is very important to him, but he doesn't really know about churches in the other locations, which shows you that the Pauline network was nowhere near as widespread in the 50s as many would seem to think. And that would explain why Josephus knows nothing about the original Paul or didn't care to talk about him. He wasn't relevant.
Well, it's now, to the Galatians.
If we imagine the 13 letters or even half or even just 7 of them being in the 50s, then how does Josephus not note it?
Right.
There were churches everywhere. Well, not literally everywhere. It's kind of exaggeration, but in enough places that it's kind of weird that Josephus doesn't talk about them. But he'll talk about it. He'll talk about Jesus, James, that's his brother apparently, and John the Baptist. But he won't talk about Paul. And I think it's really significant that Josephus doesn't talk about Paul. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century never mentions Paul. But Josephus not mentioning Paul is even more significant. Josephus is in the 1st century. Now, Justin Martyr, on the other hand, not mentioning Paul is pretty disturbing because he's in the mid-2nd century. We're still not talking about him, apparently. Well, that should raise an eyebrow or two. So I think the co-authorship explains. I think it explains most of the internal contradictions. I'll give one of my favorite ones. Philippians versus Galatians. Was Paul born of a woman, or was he a pre-existent being that might not have been born at all? In Philippians, in the Philippians hymn, it says Jesus became a man. It doesn't say he was born.
Right.
But in Galatians, he was born of a woman.
Right.
Now, Philippians is co-authored. So I can delegate it and say, oh, that's Timothy's view. He's the one that thinks Jesus pre-existed. But in Galatians, Paul doesn't think that. Jesus was born of a woman. He does not suggest that Jesus pre-existed. That's one example, in my opinion.
You can say God sent forth his son at the proper time. Well, James Dunn said that doesn't necessarily mean he went from heaven to earth. I mean, you could say that he sent forth Moses on his mission, or Jeremiah. Let's not be too hasty theologizing this thing to death.
Or the pre-existent being came into him at the baptism, or
that's another possibility.
Well, I think that Philippians is embellishing the gospel of the Hebrews, which the church fathers state. It's talking about Christ, who was the pre-existent being, possessing Jesus, and he becomes Jesus Christ. or just like a transporter accident in Star Trek when Neelix and Tuvok become.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
So that's kind of the analogy I'm using here for Jesus and Christ becoming Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that is really great. They find a way to, in effect, have my God, why have you forsaken me? Like the Gnostic said, that's the Christ leaving Jesus. And this is what is so great about science fiction. It poses what if moral questions, because when they find a way to disentangle Tuvix back into Neelix and Tuvok, he doesn't want to do it. He says, "You're going to murder me. I'm my own individual now." Well, yeah, he is. But they say, "No, sorry, we want to get the two guys back." Holy mackerel. But that kind of reflects on the whole Christology thing. What sort of union are you talking about? It's like Nestorianism and so on. Fascinating.
The standard view of things is that the contradictions can be resolved, like, for example, within 1 Corinthians, Bob, there are some people who will suggest that they're compressed. There's several letters that are being compressed into one in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or two letters in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. What the co-author theory seems to be able to explain different attitudes about the same event or the same church or at the same moment. So I have to ask, like I say, we have one of the great authorities on the contradictions within Paul right here. Which would you say is more persuasive to you? A simultaneously authored 1 Corinthians that has contradictions in it, or a compression over time?
I'm sort of hovering between the two. I have to sort of balance off the two things, just like in one of my books about this. I think in what the heck did I call it? Holy Fable, the one about the epistles. I say, well, in another book like The Amazing Colossal Apostle, I comment on all the epistles through the lens of the Dutch radical hypothesis that Paul wrote none of them. But I have to admit that the standard critical view, the 7 authentic ones, that's not unreasonable. Let's see what sense they make if you read them that way. And so I do with this alternate commentary in the other book, and then I have little footnotes saying, you see, this is where I think you got a problem, and it would make more sense if it were an interpolation or whatever. So I feel like it's a contest of paradigms, and it's almost like what Derrida says about the bricolage technique. Like, which approach are you going to take? Well, maybe you don't have to commit to one, and you can just use all of them as tools and say, now, what makes the best sense of this passage? Like the thing in Galatians, born of a woman. It seems to me that is inexplicable and even ridiculous unless that is an anti-Marcionite interpolation. I mean, why are you going to say, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he was born, he had a mom.
I presumed he was born of a woman.
And so why would you say that? Why would you point that out unless it's at issue? So there, the idea that something has simply been interpolated makes sense to me. But what Jacob says makes sense of other things. So I cannot yet totally commit myself to any one of the paradigms until I've really studied all of them much better. But this is a new and exciting possibility that he's come up with.
That is true.
My response to the Galatian issue is because there was a debate in the 90s about, was Christ and Jesus the same person? So was Christ with part of Jesus the whole time and was therefore born from a woman along with him or not. Because in the Gospel of the Hebrews, Christ and Jesus become merged as one at the baptism. And that's the kind of issue there. That's part of the dilemma that they're
makes
having.
Sense.
Because the church fathers are saying that the Ebionites viewed Paul as a heretic. But this is something else we're noting in the paper is this is one of the issues that Paul scholars are not really paying attention enough. At least a lot of them are not paying attention enough to the church fathers. The church fathers say some very odd things that I think everybody here will agree with me. They did not invent this. It would make no sense. It would create complications for the chronology of Paul and potentially even theological complications as well. So I'll start with Irenaeus. Irenaeus tells us that John of Ephesus had a confrontation with Corinthus at a bathhouse. Well, we know when that happened. It happened in the AD 90s because John wasn't in Ephesus until at the end of Domitian's reign, Emperor Domitian's reign. Well, Epiphanius is writing in the 4th century. So Irenaeus is in the 2nd century. Epiphanius is in the 4th century, just so the audience can keep this straight with me here. Epiphanius is telling us that Corinthus had a confrontation with Paul, Peter, in that James was working with him, apparently. So because Epiphanius says that the men of James were sent against Paul by Corinthus, that Corinthus was causing the whole trouble. I showed you this passage recently when I sent it to you on Messenger, Bob. And so I'm like, wait a minute. If Corinth, just to be clear, Hypatia, Stanhope, Domitian's reign ended in AD 96 when he was assassinated by a guy called Stephen. I want to come back to that.
That is true.
AD 96, they killed each other. They stabbed each other to death. That's what the Roman historians say.
Apparently quite a tough. Yeah.
So here's the problem. If Corinthus, how is it possible, because this is ridiculous, if Corinthus is having a confrontation with Paul in the AD 90s, but I'm supposed to believe, oh, well, Epiphanius is dazed and confused. Oh, it's a legend. And all this mental gymnastics to defend the AD 50s. No. We're dodging and deflecting here when we're saying stuff like that. No. How about this happened 40 years later when we realized, 40, 50 years later in time, and we realized. Most of the evidence that these letters were written in the 50s was because of Acts, which won't even talk about the letters in the first place, which is kind of funny. And I want to come back to that later. And after I explain this, okay, so how is Corinthus having a confrontation with Paul and Peter in the 90s? How's that? Well, if they're writing in the 50s,
Epiphanius.
Let me finish.
Okay.
If they're writing in the 50s, that doesn't make sense. And don't get me started with the Acts of Timothy, a late 2nd century document, which predates Irenaeus. It was written by Polycrates of Ephesus, by the way. He was of Ephesus. Just want to really note this here. The Acts of Timothy says Timothy was killed in AD 96. He was killed at the end of Domitian's reign when he was in Ephesus, when he was trying to interrupt the worship of Diana or Artemis. So in the 2nd century, a major Christian author thinks that Timothy died in the AD 90s.
Well, Epiphanius frames the debate in Galatians along with Peter's vision of the unclean foods in the same sort of temporal context. And he says that's happening when Corinthus is around. And so that would be critical if you can securely put Corinthus in the 90s in Ephesus. That would be very interesting because that would seem to frame the apostolic activity in Galatians and the beginning of Acts would orient us into a 90s place. And Irenaeus saying it's with John in Ephesus and there's this pagan this rowdy pagan festival they're reacting to, and so forth. And Timothy seems to be it depends on how much we trust that source about Timothy. Timothy appears to be dying in the 90s as well. And so what's interesting about your theory, Jacob, is that we're given now multiple reasons for thinking that maybe we've put things in the wrong time, along with, as I think we noted in an earlier podcast, Jerome. Now, Jerome contains the tradition that Paul was.
Hold on. Let me bring that up. I got the PowerPoint slide where that's discussed. Yeah, this right here is really, really bad for the 80-50s dating. This is a problem. So here's the passage, everybody. I have mentioned it a zillion times. I will mention it many, many, many more times. Well, not literally a zillion times, but y'all get the drift.
Yeah.
Jerome on Famous Men 5:5. Paul, formerly called Saul, an apostle outside a number of the 12 apostles, was of the tribe of Benjamin and the town of Giscala in Judea. When this was taken by the Romans, he removed of his parents to Tarsus in Cilicia. Sent by them to Jerusalem to study law, he was educated by Gamaliel, a most learned man whom Luke mentions. Now, what some have said to me in the past is, wait a minute, how could Paul be active after AD 70 and be taught by Gamaliel? He was taught by Gamaliel first. So, you're wrong, Jacob. I'm like, not so fast. Are we going to forget that there was a Gamaliel II who led the Sanhedrin in the late 1st century? Yes, there was a Gamaliel II who was very friendly with Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was a turncoat like Josephus was, and was praising Emperor Vespasian. Let's go further. Let's look at what Jerome says on the bottom on his commentary on Philemon. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you. He says, we have received the following story about this Epaphras, Paul's fellow prisoner. They say that the apostle Paul's parents were from the region of Giscala in Judea, and that when the whole province was laid waste, we really want everybody to pay attention to those two words there, laid waste, by the hands of the Romans, and the Jews were dispersed into the world. There are some people that will dodge and deflect and say, oh, the whole region of Giscala thing was earlier. Well, let me hover my mouse right here. Jews were dispersed into the world. Tell me with a straight face that's prior to AD 70.
And the whole province is being laid waste.
Miss me with that. They were moved to the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. As a young man, he followed the condition of his parents. And thus, what he testifies about himself can be confirmed. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's seed? So am I. And again, elsewhere, he says, Hebrew of Hebrews, and the other things that indicate that he was a Jew, more than a man of Tarsus. But if this is so, we can conjecture that Epaphras too was arrested at the time when Paul was taken. And that having been found with his own parents in Colossae, a city of Asia, he later received the word about Christ. This is why it is written to the Colossians, as we said above, Epaphras, who is one of you, a slave of Christ, greets you, being always earnest over you in his prayers.
Well, although Jerome does contain the tradition about Paul being executed under Nero,
yes, he does.
It can't be the same guy he's talking about here, because for the whole province to be laid waste and for the Jews to be dispersed, in fact, one might almost argue that sounds like the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where the Jews were actually excluded from the area.
Mm-hmm.
So let me respond to this comment real quick. Nahum El Marduk says Jerome was throwing miseducated guesses at who the real Saul Paul was. No, he was not. Does he say he was guessing? See, that's what I don't like about a lot of these assumptions about church fathers, as we're imposing modern ways of looking at text into the past. No, Jerome isn't guessing. He's certain. He's reading a document that we don't have, and he suggests heavily that this is coming from Epaphroditus. So, yeah, that's not going to work. Now,
of course, yeah.
No, he's being quite thorough that he's getting this from some document. I tend to think Epaphroditus probably wrote the "we" document. Now, where did the story of Nero come from? The martyrdom under Nero. I can show you that. Yeah. How about we find out where that story came from, right? Here it is. Josephus talks about it. A lot of people don't realize it. But wait a minute, Jacob, what are you talking about? Because Josephus doesn't mention Paul. No, he does not mention Paul, but he mentions another man called Saul, which the New Testament plagiarized, and then the Acts of Paul, which is where we get that ridiculous story about the martyrdom under Nero, in which, by the way, Paul rises from the dead and his head gets reattached to his neck. Yeah, it actually says that.
Don't tell me you're operating with an anti-supernaturalist bias. Because if you weren't, you'd accept that as fact.
Oh, look at this. Look at this.
Well, perhaps we need a Paul to have reattached his head so he could go on and write the letters after.
Look. Let me just blow through this real quick. Let me just read this. After this calamity had befallen Cestius, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city as from a ship when it was going to sink. That was a metaphor I was talking about recently. Remember that, Bob?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. This is a metaphor here. It's not literally a sinking ship, but he's comparing it to one. Costobarus, therefore, and Saul, who were brethren, together with Philip, the son of Jasimus, who was the commander of King Agrippa's forces, ran away from the city and went to Cestius. But then how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterwards slain by the seditious. We shall relate hereafter, however, Cestius sent Saul and his friends at their own desire to Achaia, to Nero, to inform him of the great distress they were in, and to lay the blame of their kindling of the war upon Florus, as hoping to alleviate his own danger by provoking his indignation against Florus. In the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were among them. And as they had them already co-opted up together in the place of public exercises, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them. They thought they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt, yet did they distrust their own wives, which were almost all of them addicted to the Jewish religion, on which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews and cut their throats as being in a narrow place in number 10,000, and all of them unarmed, in this in 1 hour's time, without anybody to disturb them. So you see, Saul and his brother Costobarus are appearing before Emperor Nero in Achaia. Oh, so that's where they get it from. It's from this guy, Saul. He's not Paul. He's not literally the historical Paul, but they're lifting the story from him to create the idea that Paul was executed by Emperor Nero. It's coming from Josephus.
That makes a lot of sense.
After Josephus brought this up, he never talks about Saul and Costobarus. That's it. They're gone.
So what we have to do is, in effect, belly up to the bar and say Acts is misleading us. This Acts is conflating multiple characters into Paul, and therefore misleading us about the time frames involved. Again, to vindicating Bob to some degree, the Paul that we hear about in Acts, who has in effect different conversion stories, right? Character in Acts who doesn't seem probable to be before the war, in effect, but we're being misled as to the time frame. Acts doesn't mention that he wrote any letters either. But we're being misled in Acts as to the nature of who this Paul guy is, just straight up. He maybe himself be a conflation of multiple figures, like Simon Magus, Dr. Price has suggested, or elements from Josephus. He has a shipwreck, and perhaps a Saul or two before there was our letter writing Paul. But it does seem to me clear that Jerome is citing a source, and citing a source that would indicate that Paul was a young man. The guy he's translating, Jerome's a translator. The guy I'm translating, I've got a source that says he was a young man when the entire province was laid waste and the Jews were dispersed into the world. Wow. That a guy who's a young man in 70 AD, the earliest that could possibly be in my mind, could not be someone executed by Nero, could not be someone who was active back in the 40s and 50s.
And look at this real quick. I don't mean to cut you off, James.
No.
I'm sorry. But I want to add to that. This is what Clement says about Paul's death. He's writing like 100+ years before the Acts of Paul's written. There was Peter, who by reason of unrighteous jealousy endured not one, but many labors, and thus having borne his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory. By reason of jealousy and strife, Paul, by his example, pointed out the prize of patient endurance. After that, he had been 7 times, I really want people to notice this here, 7 times in bonds. 7 times in bonds? That's not in our New Testament. Had been driven into exile, had been stoned, had preached in the east and in the west. He won the noble renown, which was the reward of his faith. Having taught righteousness unto the whole world, having reached the furthest bounds of the west, and when he had borne his testimony before the rulers, so he departed from the world and went unto the holy place, having been found a notable pattern of patient endurance. As Oscar Coleman in the early 20th century noted, he believes from what Clement writes here that Paul was killed by rival believers, given how jealousy is linked to both Peter and Paul's death. It makes perfect sense to me, and this completely contradicts the idea that Romans killed Paul. That's not what Clement says.
What's interesting there is that
he knows nothing about Paul being killed by Romans.
What's interesting there is that he's not dependent on Romans, where Paul says, "I'm headed to the west. I want to go to the west." He's saying he made it to the west.
Yeah, because in Romans 15, Paul says, I'm going to go to Hispania. Not that I made it there, but in Clement, he makes it furthest west of the empire. I'm like, oh, so he made it. So where he sometimes has quasi-parallels to canonical Paul, he also contradicts it. Now, how do we explain that if Clement knows these letters? That doesn't really make sense. These letters are stitched. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, by the same token, from what you just mentioned, how does Jerome, does he ever explain how Paul, the letter writer, the apostle, could have been born after the moved to Giscala after the Roman conquest?
No, he doesn't. He doesn't. He does not. He does not explain it.
Wow.
He brings up the contradiction, doesn't offer an explanation for how that's going to make sense with an earlier Paul. He just doesn't.
And 7 doesn't square with the, Paul in 2 Corinthians gives us this little autobiography.
I mean,
fails.
I think. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to cut you off, but I just wanted to say real quick. But the issue is that there's 3 different deaths for Paul. We have Paul dying 3 times. What did he die in AD 39, which is what Clement's chronology seems to indicate? Around the late AD 30s at the very least. Did he die in AD 66 by Nero's hand? As Josephus implies and the Acts of Paul embellishes? Or did he die in AD 97 when the men of James went after him in Antioch? We have 3 different deaths here.
This reminds me of the case that Jesus, the fact that people had different estimates as to when Jesus lived and died. That Irenaeus says, well, he was killed in the reign of Claudius, and he was nearly 70 years old or whatever it was. And then some think that in the Talmud, there's a reference to Jesus living at the time of, what's her name? The queen who was the widow of...
Helena, yeah.
Yeah. And so what's the deal there? Was there any real common knowledge as to when we know that there are different estimates as to what day Jesus was born. But that's fairly trivial. But if you can't be sure of which century he lived. This reminds me of that. Who knows if any of this stuff is historical, or if there's a core, which one of these guys was the original? Mm.
Paul seems to be particularly slippery, as I say. We're not given consistent history in Acts. There's 2 or 3 conversion stories, that, and the conversion stories within Acts themselves don't line up, as someone here has pointed out.
And
So
they're based on Euripides the Bacchae and on 2 Maccabees chapter 3 with the miraculous convention of King Pentheus to the faith of Dionysus, which leads to his being killed. And what the heck? And the all the parallels to Josephus. Is that because he was Josephus, as some say? I don't think so. But it does imply to me that whoever wrote Acts is simply borrowing all that exciting stuff from Josephus's autobiography and making up yet another part of Paul's biography because nobody knew what he really did.
I don't disagree, but I also think Acts was lifting from whatever Epaphroditus wrote.
Well,
it wasn't backdating, resituating the chronology into the 50s, replacing Gamaliel II with the first one, and all that nonsense.
Makes sense. I got to say.
Assumption.
Hold on, Miguel, you've been quiet for a while. You want to jump in?
I have not much to say. Yeah, I thought we were going to talk about Marcion and St. Paul, and we're somewhere else. Not my wheelhouse. I like how somebody said Drew Lewis said Paul was CIA, so I think that works. In fact, I want Paul was CIA.
Oh.
I think the salient question is Paul on Epstein's list? That's all I got.
Well, Hermann Dettering, a big Marcion fan, said that he figured that the epistolarian Paul was really Marcion. And so that gives us a second Paul, at least, if he's right about that. And so there was a legendary Paul and an epistolary Paul who were not the same character. And that's another way of prying the character apart.
I do want to get to the Gnostic part because I even mentioned in the beginning that we would get there, and then we can circle back to the co-author thing later on. But do you see elements because you did say earlier that the co-author thing explains a lot of it, but some of it, which I do agree with you, by the way, it doesn't explain. I think probably the biggest point there that you might agree with is the temporal issues, the chronological issues of the letters is not explained by multiple authors necessarily, simultaneous authorship, and I agree with that. But what about Gnostic elements? This is something I really want to ask you and Miguel about, is Gnostic elements in Paul. Do you see that as hints that of other sources or pre-Pauline views? What do you both think about that stuff?
I would agree with David Bentley Hart, who says everybody's missed Paul. I guess he would disagree with who said the famous quote, Frank Overbeck. Nobody understands Paul except Marcion, and even Marcion misunderstood him. Famous quote. But I would say everybody's misunderstood Paul, and I think David Bentley Hart gets it right that the gospel of Paul is very simple. The archons have taken over the world, and Jesus is here to liberate them. Everything else is a footnote. So I think that's it. I think that's what was in the air. I think that's what's been, you might say, overlooked or buried by academia and theology. The fact that the idea of angels coming and usurping the world was really big in the air in those times, whether it was Jesus or Paul and all that. And that was that was really what was on their radar. Who's going to free us from these angels who have brought these horrible empires, and what are we going to do? And you see that all over, the Mediterranean and so forth. And I think that's Paul's big thrust. As far as authorship, schizophrenia could be it, right? I mean, the ancient Egyptians talked about schizophrenia. It's been around for hundreds of years. And there's always been functional schizophrenics, whether it's David Bowie or Philip K. Dick. They have existed. They have voices in their head, and they can create incredible theology and art and so forth. But going back to Paul, I would say, yeah, I think that was his thrust, and I think the Gnostics saw him as Elvis Presley, and they took his ideas and they dialed it up to 11. It's very simple. I don't like to overcomplicate things.
Well, what's interesting about what you said there, this is something else I'm going to bring up in the paper. I don't want to talk too much in the paper that I'm writing for Bob about co-authorship, explaining the contradictions. I want to cover that more in depth in a separate paper, because the paper is primarily geared towards redating the letters based on internal and external references. But yeah, that's also an issue in canonical Paul, because in 1 Corinthians he does say, as you've pointed out, and this is also expressed again in 2 Corinthians, that archons, or Satan, was behind Jesus' death. But in 1 Thessalonians, the Jews are blamed for Jesus' death. And then in 1 Timothy, although it doesn't explicitly state that Pilate was behind Jesus' death, Paul notes that Jesus made the good confession to Pilate, kind of implying that Pilate was behind his death. Now,
he's like Al Pacino. You're all out of order. This whole place is out of order. The Jews, the Romans, everybody's out of order except Jesus. That's the only one who's not out of order. So
I think the co-authorship can explain it, because in 1 and 2 Corinthians, Paul's co-authors had a different point of view. They're the ones talking about the archons as Satan being behind Jesus' death. Because we have to remember, when you read the beginning of 1 Corinthians, Paul and Sophanes wrote it. That's what it says at the very beginning. And 2 Corinthians was Paul and Timothy. Timothy is the one with the more celestial view of Jesus when you read Philippians. So when you look at 1 Timothy, that's where Paul brings Pilate into the situation. So I think there are different points of view, and the text doesn't agree with itself about who the primary responsibility for Jesus' death falls to. Then in the canonical Gospels, they bring those points of view together by making Satan in control of governments, and then saying that he influenced the Jews into killing Jesus. Because especially as you progress from Mark all the way to John, this point is made more and more and more. Like in Matthew, the Jews say that their blood is on their hands forever and passed down for all time. That Jesus' blood is on their hands and their descendants. In Luke, Satan possesses Judas. And then in John chapter 8, it calls the Jews the sons of the devil. So you see how the viewpoint, this hostility, is kind of increased from gospel to gospel. And they're kind of blending together the views of the archons and Pilate. And like they're all on the same team, if you get what I'm saying. Whereas in canonical Paul, it's all over the place. Like, well, this people over here is responsible. No, they are. And then Pilate's brought in it. No one letter tries to blend it all together. If you get what I'm saying.
Well, how do we square all this with Romans 13 when we're told that the government is God's appointed agent on earth?
That's a great question.
Out of moral duty, not simply to get along.
All governments. That's the answer. It says all governments are appointed by God, and rebellion against them is insurrection against God, precisely. And I think that was Tertius, the co-author of Romans, that really had that view, not so much Paul, because when in the single author letters of Paul, that Paul is not insinuating that. You get this in Romans. Now, John Dominic Crossan explains for different reasons. He sees Romans 13 as a difficulty. Romans 13, 1-7, he says it's an interpolation. It's like, oh, Paul was an idiot if he wrote that. I'm like, well, he didn't. Tertius did. That's what I think.
I have a question for you guys, and let me know if there's an ancient answer to this, but there is something in modern times called a cut-up technique, and it's something that William Burroughs, Brian Eno, David Bowie, and Stanley Kubrick use, which is you write different things with different people, and you throw it together, and you just let it, for an artistic or spiritual reason, you leave it. That answers why people think, well, Stanley Kubrick was a perfectionist, but why does he have so many mistakes in his movies? Because he used to just throw stuff together with his screenwriter and just say, we're going to do it this way. And that's why you do get, again, William Burroughs' incredible novels, which were just thrown together. David Bowie, his lyrics are like a hodgepodge. It was a technique that was very popular, the absurdists you really were into. Is there anything in ancient times where people just said, I've got all these letters and holy things, and I will throw them together, and God will make it right, and don't worry about the paradoxes? Anything like that in ancient
I'll go
times?
first because what you just did was explain my theory.
Really?
Yeah, that's my theory, literally. That's the whole point. When you read Galatians, Paul.
So they didn't see anything wrong with it, right?
No, they didn't.
Perfect.
If you read
their
Romans,
genre.
it's cool to lie. It's cool to spread falsehood. We read Romans chapter 3. Falsehood is okay as long as it abounds to the glory of God.
The Noble Lie by Plato.
Yeah, and in 1 Corinthians, well, it's in one of the Corinthian letters, one or two Corinthians. It stated that, Paul says, "I'm all things to all men. I tell one group of people this and another group of people that." And then in Galatians it says there's no Jew, Greek, Gentile, slave, or free. We're all under Christ. So it's already suggesting different points of view don't matter. Contradictions don't matter as long as we're all in it together, right? We're all worshiping Christ one way or the other.
And the fascinating thing is he contradicts himself about that. In Corinthians, he'll say, "Oh, don't bother yourself."
Yes, he gets pissed off about Cephas and Apollos.
Cephas, of Paul, of Jesus. But then he'll say, "How soon you forget the message I brought you? You guys should get back on the dime." So he's even contradicting himself about being contradictory. So you're upset with me that I'm contradicting the message you left me with, but on the other hand, you're saying never mind about these different schools.
That's what makes this situation interesting, is that on top of the fact it's a co-authored mess, hence the title of the show, it's lying is being openly condoned in Romans chapter 3, and it's stated elsewhere that contradictions do not matter. So sometimes in certain situations you have to wonder, when is it because Paul is lying, or when is it when a co-author is saying something different? Now, most of the times, most of the instances, I would say co-authorship explains it well, but also we have to factor in Paul's deceit, which I'll say can be it could be a bit difficult. And that's why I think the best way to handle it is to look at the single authored letters. And let's bring Marcion back in here. What was Marcion trying to do? He was trying to clean up this mess. He was removed. When you read Marcion's Paul, Marcion's Paul is very consistent and coherent. I cannot recall a single time that Marcion's Paul has a contradiction in it against itself. Maybe I missed a couple, but it's pretty coherent. And for instance, he does away with the pastoral letters. So there's no mention of Pilate. So the whole Pilate business is removed. In Marcion's edition of 1 Thessalonians, the wrath of God is not mentioned. Although the blaming of the Jews or Jesus' death is still there. And in 1 and 2 Corinthians, it does talk about, well, really, I'll stick to 1 Corinthians. It does talk about, I believe it talked about the archons being behind Jesus' death. So the viewpoints are not as contradictory, at least in the Marcionite edition. They're not as difficult to harmonize necessarily. one could argue, well, what First Corinthians meant by archons and Marcion's edition is it had the archons working with the Judeans to bring down Jesus, to crucify Jesus. So it doesn't have the same kind of tension that it would have in the canonical text, where it's complete. And I'm being a little bit charitable, I suppose, with my interpretation of the Marcionite edition here, but in general, it's not as contradictory with the canonical edition, and that's why I think if the canonical edition is an expansion of Marcion's Paul, it makes no sense, because that would mean they added all that stuff about lying is spreading falsehood is okay, add co-authors to divide Paul's authority. That it would have been difficult for people, especially without a computer, because like we have to consider all the stuff that they would have needed, all the resources that they would have needed to add. I'm not saying adding didn't happen; it did, but I don't recall an example that we actually know with certainty that it happened in this way with another text. Like Second Maccabees, for instance, admits that it's an abridgment.
Mm-hmm.
So we have examples of abridging.
Well, the whole point of interpolation is to give it the authority of the original document. And so that like I said at the beginning, it's a strange thing if you're going to add a co-author. Well, you heard the first version of this. Now I'm Timothy or Sosthenes coming in.
But I agree. Let me step back and say, but in a way, I do agree adding happened, technically, because Clement only knew one letter of Paul. At least that's all he tells us. So the canonical letters, because let me just make this clear. I mentioned the 3 deaths earlier. Well, Saul is not the original Paul the Apostle. The Saul of Giscala that Jerome is talking about cannot be the same person that fled from King Aretas in the 8030s. He's not the same person that Clement's talking about. This is a different person who's writing in Paul's name. He's expanding Paul's text. So in a way, it was added to. But the co-authors were living in his time. They were working with him. Clement never mentions Timothy. In First Clement, Timothy's not there. John the Pillar. All these other people that are in Paul's letters are not there. They're just not there. He doesn't know about these people. At least he doesn't say any of this in First Clement. So that's something that I wanted to bring in here. That the Marcionite edition is trying to harmonize. And this goes back to your point, Miguel, that Marcion may not have gotten it right either, completely. Well, I think there's truth to that, because I think Marcion is trying to harmonize whatever Paul originally wrote with the canonical text. And he's not going to get that right either. And he also may want to make sure it fits his theology to a certain degree. So I'll leave it there. What are your all thoughts on that?
What I want to know is why. I mean, like you said, Josephus doesn't mention Paul. I mean, we have to admit, probably nobody gave nothing about Paul except for the Gnostics and Marcion until late 2nd century? Isn't that the question? Why was Paul so important to the early church when he shouldn't have been? He had to be. Basically, he was appropriated. Something about his theology was very important.
Sure.
Even though they hated it, like Tertullian says, he's only the heretics and the Gnostics and the Marcionites read that stuff. It's like Fox News or something. I don't know what the comparison is. But why do you think that happened? Isn't that?
Yeah, I think what happened is, the way I would explain it is, if you look at Clement's view, Clement's material on Paul, he doesn't say a whole lot about him. It's not, when you look at Clement's Paul, it's not, he doesn't have a church network that's widespread. He doesn't. He traveled a bit, although not as much as the canonical Paul did. But he did travel around, but he didn't have churches everywhere. He didn't have a lot of letters. So the original Paul wasn't as relevant. He was relevant to Clement, but he didn't have, if you get what I'm saying, he wasn't as major as Acts portrayed him, or as canonical Paul was suggesting. This is his life has been heavily remade and embellished to make us to make people at the time and make people later believe that Paul was a major famous person when he originally was not. But people writing in his name and reappropriating his theology and remaking him is what made Paul famous later, after Josephus had lived and died. So I think that's my answer to your question. And that's why I think that because Paul's text became what they are now, the canonical texts in the 90s, that's why in the 2nd century, because that's what I'm saying, the letters became the way they are at the end of the 1st century, not in the mid-1st century, at the end of the 1st century. And that's why in the 2nd century, because Marcion was in the 140s, in the 2nd century, that's when the letters start becoming famous, but not.
That's around where Valentinus was, and he's having a transmission of Paul too.
Yeah,
probably around the same time Marcion, and it's
exactly
a different Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it fits the time. The shifting the canonical letters at the end of the 1st century still fits that timeline, and it still explains why Josephus didn't talk about him, because there was nothing to really talk about him. Not yet.
And
unless he was in a mystery religion and you just didn't talk about these things.
Mystery religion and what?
He was in a mystery religion and you didn't talk about mystery religions and what people did. There was still a respect. You were invisible.
Paul calls it a mystery. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do have, what's interesting is that you do at the very least have proto-Gnostic elements in Paul. It's hard to say that he's got the full-on, some Diacomaty stuff is obviously unknown to Paul. On the other hand, he seems to be giving a kind of ideological step in that direction that's noticeable more than once. But you've also got to reckon with the fact that Paul doesn't seem aware of nearly any of the gospel details. I mean, he quotes Jesus once with the Eucharist, but I think that's about it. And I mean, apart from born of a woman, seed of David, hung on a staros, buried and risen on the 3rd day, we don't have much of biographical, unless we include like Timothy, because then we've got Pilate to whom he gave witness, right? But the point is, we have precious few biographical details. And it seems to me that if Paul had the Gospels, they would have, or that information about Jesus, it would have been helpful to him in many, many instances. So I still got to think that the Gospels are themselves kind of reconciling maybe the Pauline and Petrine traditions in a reconciliation with greater detail and addressing the needs of that time. But I guess I still got to believe the standard view that Paul, at least some of Paul, predates the Gospels. I mean, we still have people writing in Paul's, and this is what Christians do, right? Even you, Jacob, will admit 3 Corinthians is someone writing in Paul's name well after canonical letters are written. For gosh sake, we have a correspondence that was invented.
I think Lucius Carinus, the same guy that actually wrote the Acts of Paul, wrote 3 Corinthians.
And we've got a correspondence that they create between Paul and Seneca, for gosh sakes, at a still later point.
Somewhere around there.
So people are writing in Paul's name, and they're just sitting down and writing, this is what Paul wrote to someone else, to the Corinthians or to Seneca, long after even where you date the canonical letters, which is still well after the 50s and 60s, which is the standard date for the, quote, authentic Paul.
Let me correct myself. Lucius Carinus was close to 180 AD, not 190. So just continue. Sorry.
But the point is, we've got Christians writing in previous authorities' names, whether it's Paul or Clement or Peter or whoever else it is. That's what Christians did. They wrote in the name of some earlier authority to give it that authority. The co-author theory is interesting because it's not being straight up. I mean, if you're going to use Paul's authority, use Paul's, authority. Don't dilute that by saying, oh yeah, well, Sosthenes helped here and Timothy helped here. And, what that does is dilute the very purpose for interpolation, or if you're just writing a letter straight up in some previous authority's name.
It does, yeah.
I mean, the Epistle of James seems to mention the death of a righteous man. He's mentioning his own
James
death.
5:6. Yeah, so how can you be the James that died in AD 36, the one that Paul attacked in the Clementine recognitions?
Right.
If you know, but by the way, the letter of James doesn't even claim to be by James, a brother of Jesus. It just says, it begins like something like James, a follower of Lord Jesus Christ. He's not claiming to be his brother. So it's some different Christian called James. Well, I think was the same one that Paul was confronting in Galatians anyway. So he's like,
well, and seeing that preference,
the consensus already agrees that the letter of James, or at least most of them agree, that the letter of James was written in the 90s. That's
and
an
that
interesting
reference in Josephus, when you put it together with Galatians, convinces a lot of people, oh, see, Galatians had to have been written before the death of James the brother. That is in 62, according to Josephus.
But it's not the same James. It can't be, because the original James and the recognitions died 30 years earlier. It can't be the same guy.
So if we've got multiple Pauls, multiple Jameses, multiple Peters or Kephases, maybe multiple Clements, we have Christians whose habit it is to write in the authority of the name of some earlier authority. That's
suppose, what if these things were written in Paul's name later, but the first people to read these pseudepigraphical letters had no real idea of when Paul lived or who he was, because there wasn't that much communication. And somehow the actual date of the first appearance was combined with the belief that it really was Paul. And so you wind up having people that don't really know the details making Paul a contemporary living at the time this actually false letter from him appeared. That might explain why some thought that Paul was a later figure. All you'd need is somebody saying, oh, hey, this is by Paul. Wow.
right.
And he must have just written it. Well, somebody did just write it, claiming to be Paul. That might conceivably have led to different beliefs about the date of Paul as the epistle writer.
Explaining perhaps Jerome's own contradictions on them.
Yeah, he heard this from people that made that mistake, and he's just putting it in there as some people believe this. He says, we have received this. That's almost a way of saying, well, I don't know, but I've been told.
Well, like I said, Jerome doesn't explain the contradiction. He leaves that whole thing out. It moves on to other stuff. But I think he didn't know what to make of it, because it would conflict with his standard dating of the letters, and he just doesn't want to deal with it. But I don't think Christians, even in an earlier period, would invent that story, because to me, what Saul of Giscala is he is basically a pseudo Paul in a way. He changed his identity. He's a pseudo Paul in a way.
Yes,
he changed his identity to Paul, and that's why in Acts it says Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's really striking.
And he and his co-authors, because if we look at the Acts Timothy, because we'd have to. The problem with this view, in my opinion, is you would have to then lump in the Acts Timothy and other texts that are moving Paul's co-authors later in time by saying, oh, they were just guessing too. And that's why I think it becomes implausible, because the Acts of Timothy is putting Timothy's death in the 90s. And it's a 2nd century text, late 2nd century text. So that's the issue, is why would they create these stories when they would rather have Paul live earlier in time? But to insinuate that Saul of Giscala and Paul are not the same person would create more issues that they would not want to deal with, is my point. And Clement knows nothing about these other people. He's talking about the original Paul from the 30s, who wasn't really the Paul that we think of today. So he was very, very different from the Paul we imagine today.
I have one other crazy possibility, and then I got to get going. But two things I want to leave you with. To try to understand the whole idea of pseudepigraphical Pauline epistles, a few years ago, I wrote something that I'm going to publish pretty soon called Paul, the Lost Epistles, in which I posed as Paul and wrote 13 new epistles to the church at Antioch, the church at Alexandria, the church at Cenchrea, etc., where I have Paul deal with questions that he doesn't ever actually get to in the canonical epistles. And it was like a thought experiment based on the impression you get of this writer. What might he have said about, how might he have dealt with this or that? So stay tuned for Paul, plus a new apocalypse of Paul that I constructed. So Paul, the Lost Epistles might be an interesting thing to look at. But another crazy thing, Martin Note, in his History of Pentateuchal Tradition, speaks of, well, I forget if he calls it this or not, but I call it the redundancy principle. He says you can tell that originally, that Moses has been added to stories in which somebody else was originally the hero. Like when Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu go up the mountain and have a feast in the presence of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And Note says that, what are these other guys even doing there? It must be that originally the story was about Nadab and Abihu going to have dinner with God. But as Moses became more and more important, they said, let's put Moses in here. But you didn't want to omit the familiar sacred names that were already in there. So you just sort of shoved them out of the spotlight and put them as sidekicks to Moses. Well, I think he makes a good case for that. And it made me think, is that possibly why you have Paul along with Sosthenes, Alfred E. Newman and Winston Churchill, the different writers? It's possible that one of these guys or more wrote these, and someone has simply added Paul's name but didn't feel at liberty to cut out the names of the actual authors. So it wasn't written by somebody claiming to be Paul. Somebody just decided to slap his name on it because his name had become even more important than the others, about whom we know almost nothing because they faded into obscurity in the shadow of Paul as he got magnified over the centuries. But again, crazy. I know I'm being measured for a straitjacket tomorrow. But it occurred to me.
Why stop this? Bob, that's a great idea, though. Your first idea. Keep writing in Paul's name. Why should we let this stop? Just keep on going. People just keep writing letters and ascribing them to Paul.
But you're adding to the apocalypse of Paul. You're expanding on his journeys through the heavens.
Yeah, there are two already we know of, a Gnostic one and a Catholic one. I did a third one in which it has to do with, it elaborates on his visionary journey to the third heaven and a number of things like that, and it spells out what happened there in the heavenly throne room, and when an angel of Satan punched him in the nose and so on. So I figured, well, let me just spin it out like these guys originally did, sort of a midrashic version. And it gives you an interesting insight on possibly how the New Testament works were written. I composed a gospel for the Unification Church when I was briefly teaching for them to substitute for a friend who was in a car accident. And so I decided, I was talking to one of the faculty there, and he said, why is it that nobody gives our divine principle book much attention? I mean, they're reading everybody else's scripture. And I said, well, it's because it reads like an auto repair manual. There's nothing winsome or entertaining or interesting about it. I said, let me show you what I think you could use as a gospel that would interest people. So I wrote one up with new Jesus stories with a unificationist slant. It is enormously fun, and it pulls things out of your mind you never would have thought of before. So I commend you, gents. I recommend you to do the same. So start forging biblical documents. It's great fun.
If you don't entertain them, you're lost. That's job number one, right, Bob? Entertain your audience.
Amen.
Let me take these super. I know we're about to close in a second. I know you're gonna get going, Bob. Let me go through these 4 super chats real quick before we close. They've been waiting a while. Solar at Night, thank you for your super chat. Paul often dictated to scribes that were given some level of freedom in word choice. Instant paraphrasing. Beware of scribes, Mark 12:38-40. My response real quick is, yeah, he did dictate the scribes, but the co-authors weren't scribes, they were co-authors. There's a difference between a co-author and a scribe.
Well, could that be the difference between Tertius in Rome at the end of Romans, though, and Timothy and Sosthenes elsewhere?
No, I'm not convinced of that, because Paul in Romans does not say he dictated a letter.
Well, that was the normal practice, though. I mean, why go through the hassle of, writing with your old arthritic hands? I'm coming to appreciate that myself, If you got a slave there and you can just dictate it, it would seem in ancient times we're in fact given a couple of descriptions that's how it happened. So, and it seems logical.
I don't recall Paul saying in Romans that he ever dictated the letter. I don't think he did.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I can't myself think of any source moment where Paul says that out loud.
Solar Knight, thank you for another super chat. Many Hollywood actors die many times. First century Hollywood.
More like Hollywood.
And drummers too. Remember Spinal Tap. Don't be.
I guess
yes.
back to it, and Paul says, "This is my signature." This is me signing it. That could be an indicia that it was in fact dictated to a scribe, and that look, I'm putting my final, seal or signature on it. One could infer that.
I think that is the idea, and I think that's one of the big clues that these are not by Paul, because when he says, look at the big letters I'm using, this is the mark of authenticity in all my letters. Well, that's a funny thing, because why would he have to say, look at the big letters? I mean, if you were actually reading the original letter, you wouldn't need to be told that. And so that's a sign. It's like a guy in a letter in a novel. I apologize for the cheap stationery I'm using. Gerald Prince gets into this in his book Narratology. Or if you have an I, Paul, say so and so, look at the way that is used in apocryphal works. Zillions of them where it's not Paul, it's claiming to be something you wouldn't have to claim if you really were the person. You're trying to convince somebody that you're Paul. And I think there's a lot of neglected signs of pseudepigraphy that people just don't notice.
My personal opinion would be that's because when he really wants to make it clear that the co-author didn't write that part.
Well, though this is always at the end, so you figure he would have written the wrap up.
Okay. Well, I think there were a couple of cases where it wasn't at the end, but I could be misremembering right now. Audio Morgan's turn. Thank you for your super chat. Wasn't Marcion somewhat proud that his group knew the truth about Paul and made fun off other groups and their interpretations of Paul?
I don't know. Do we have any discussion of that in ancient writers?
No, I don't recall. I mean, I suppose in a way he just didn't really want to deal with the theology of the other group, since the church fathers say that he cut down the letters, made them smaller. He's trying to make Paul more coherent in his own eyes, I think.
Yeah, there's no doubt Marcion believes in the authority of Paul and seems to be relying on that authority more than any previous Christian had, because we see in our canonical, whether they were before or after, whether they're ripped out and reduced by Marcion, or whether the Apocryphon is the original and it's added to. In either case, Marcion seems to place great weight on Paul's authority.
So Laura and I, thank you for another super chat. The word of God implies God dictated the Bible.
Well, that's only if you think that references in the Bible to the Word of God mean the Bible, which I think they virtually never do. It means the promise of God, the message of God, the decree of God. I tried to point that out in my pre-Nicene New Testament translation.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and close, everybody. So I want to thank everybody for watching and thank everybody for the super chats. Before we close, all the links to all the guest relevant respective materials in the description below, like to Jim Valiant's book and his website, Creating Christ website. But Miguel Connor, you want to tell everybody what your podcast is called, real quick? Want to remind everybody about that. Where you can go find it.
AM by Gnostic Radio, and website's thegodabovegod.com.
You can also see him on Gaia.
Yes, I was on Gaia talking Elvis.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting little factoid before you go. I found a handwritten letter by Elvis Presley where he quotes the Gospel of Thomas number 2. Yes, Elvis knew Thomas. So in his own
Elvis knew Thomas.
Yeah, I bet you didn't have that in your bingo card.
Wow,
No, I did not.
That is so great.
That's awesome.
He was. There was rumors that he liked the Gnostic Gospels, but I found proof in his own handwriting. So.
Wow. Where is that letter? I hope you have it framed.
I do. I'll email it to you.
Great. Oh my God, it's amazing.
Yeah. Strange world we live in, right, guys?
Oh yeah. Wow. Fascinating.
I like. If you don't mind, I'd like to see that too.
Sure. I'll message you.
Let's hope it's not a pseudograph.
Did he have co-authors? Yeah, Colonel Parker was helping him write it. Or something.
Oh, and Bob, just finish off with you. Where can everybody go find the Bible Geek?
I haven't done one in a while because I've been here instead.
Don't you have a Substack?
Well, actually, I'm sorry.
Don't you have a Substack where you've been writing stuff right now?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I am on Substack with different essays, and also my Zarathustra Speaks column on Patreon. Yeah, right. So, yeah. And I have new stuff in the Journal of Higher Criticism every issue.
Like I said earlier, I'll have the links to all of their stuff in the description below and their respective books. And that being said, Jim, Miguel, and Bob, thank you all for joining me today.
Oh, what a treat. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Really
Thanks
fun.
for having us.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.